Welcome my darlings, thank you for joining me today for another video. If it's your first time seeing me, my name is Annie and I post true crime cases here on my channel. So if you are here, that means that you're a true crime enthusiast as I am. Make sure you click on the notification bell and subscribe to this channel. So today we are all the way in Hawaii. Let's look into the case of Lisa Au. So Lisa was born to her parents Chester and Patrice on July the 25th, 1962. Her father Chester was Chinese while her mother Patrice was from Hawaii. She also had a younger sister called Mary who was born much later, so there was this wide age gap between the both of them. Lisa was described by people who knew her growing up as a good kid and very responsible. As she grew up, she became quite a hardworking young lady. When Lisa was 19, she graduated from Trendsetter Movie College in Honolulu. Upon graduation, she needed to find a job, so she ended up getting one as a hairdresser at a salon known as Susan Beer Salon. She had only been working at this salon just a little bit over a month, about 5 weeks or thereabout, before tragedy struck. So on the 20th of January 1982, it was about 45 minutes past 9, that's almost 10 p.m. and Lisa, who had been working a shift at the salon, had made plans to head to her boyfriend's sister's home in Waikiki. That night, there was this serious downpour. It happened to be raining heavily. Some sort of storm was kind of going on. She didn't see this coming. I don't know if there was no weather forecast at the time, but Lisa didn't expect the rain to be that serious. So she thought maybe if she stayed back at work and waited, the rain would subside and she would make her way to her boyfriend's sister's house as planned. But after waiting for a while, it was apparent the rain wasn't going to stop anytime soon. So she left in the rain, but not before letting her co-workers know where she was headed. Now, the idea was for her to meet up with her boyfriend, then have dinner, then return home afterwards. The guy she was dating at the time was called Doug Holmes. They had actually met at a restaurant where he worked part-time. He was also an engineering student at the University of Hawaii at the time. The thing that bothered me most from the beginning of this case was that Lisa had no business being out in the storm alone at that time of the night in the first place. She had just begun driving. She had only gotten her license just a few days before, precisely on the 18th of January. Was she an experienced driver enough to drive in such weather conditions? Probably not. But she had to be somewhere that was important to her, so she risked it. So as she headed out, she made a quick stop at a grocery store called MJ's where she purchased some items. Then she proceeded on her way and got herself safely to Doug's sister's house. By 20 minutes past 12 a.m., she was ready to go after she had spent a couple of hours there and had eaten dinner with Doug, who was there. This was now on the 21st of January, right? So I'm not sure why she had to leave. I mean, it was raining heavily. It was very odd hours. She should have just stayed till daylight, or maybe she had other stuff to do, so she had to leave. So after dinner, Doug walks Lisa to her car. They say their good nights, then they both left in their separate cars. So Lisa drives off for her home in Kailua. Doug heads back to his dorm at the University of Hawaii, which was right there in Honolulu, so it wasn't exactly far from his sister's house. Back at her home in Kailua, Lisa's roommate Candy was waiting for her to return. According to her, she had gotten a call from Lisa at about 12:30 a.m. Other reports said it was 12:45 a.m., so I'm not sure of the exact time. So Lisa had called her that she was headed home after having dinner with her boyfriend Doug Holmes at his sister's place in Honolulu. Candy tells Lisa to be careful driving in the heavy rain, and that was the last time she heard from her because Lisa never did come home. So after that call, Candy waited up expecting Lisa to come in, but after waiting a while, she figured Lisa would just let herself in. She needed to catch some sleep, so she did. She went to bed. When she woke up the next morning, she was expecting Lisa to be home already while she was asleep. I mean, she had called to say she was on her way, right? So why then was she not yet home? So she thought maybe the rain was too much for her to drive, or maybe she decided to stay with her boyfriend Doug. Whichever way, Lisa will find her way to the salon where they worked together later on in the day. At the salon, the usual time when Lisa would come in passed, and there was no Lisa still. So her roommate decided it was time to let her family know. So she called Lisa's parents to tell them the situation of things. Lisa's family communicated with Doug that same morning of the 21st of January when her roommate called to let them know Lisa didn't come home nor show up for work. They asked if he had seen her, but he said he hadn't, and that he had seen her last when they parted ways as they were leaving his sister's. But he set out immediately on the same path Lisa would have taken home in search for her, and that was how Lisa just became a missing person. Well, a search began immediately, and like I said, Doug too was out there looking for his girlfriend. Then at about 12:30 p.m. that afternoon of the 21st, he sees it. He spots Lisa's vehicle. Her 1976 Toyota was parked on the sideway of the highway heading towards Kailua. Doug stops his car and runs over to the vehicle, but to his disappointment, the vehicle was empty. The place where Lisa's car was spotted was actually only a couple of miles from her and Candace's apartment. It also was about a mile away from her parents' home. So, she was literally almost home. So where could she be, and what could have happened between this short distance she had to cover to get home? Anyways, Doug immediately lets the police know, and they send somebody out there to check things out. When the police arrived at the scene, they began to examine the car, and they noticed that Lisa's keys were still in the ignition. The car lights and the windshield wipers were in the on position, but the car itself was not on. This meant that the car battery was drained, right? So after they charged the vehicle, it came up and everything was working perfectly. Another observation was that her car windows were one down. The driver's side window was about halfway up, and there was a pool of water inches deep on the entire floor of the car. Remember, there was a serious downpour, so the rain got into the car pretty much. But one weird unexplained thing at the time was that Lisa's purse was right there on the seat and it was dry. It's weird because here was her car very wet, inches of water in it, car seats all wet. How come her purse, which was on the wet seat, not wet? There was also a package and some change of clothes left behind in her vehicle, which was not wet as well. The scene was processed and nothing was found in the car. There was obviously no fingerprints. Maybe because of the rain. Maybe the rain might have wiped them off, or whosoever took Lisa wiped them off. Either way, the vehicle had been wiped clean. Her wallet was inside the dry purse, but when investigators looked, her driver's license was not in her wallet. They checked the glove compartment for her registration, and the registration too was nowhere to be found. Where could Lisa be then? What could have happened to her? Did she get stopped by a car? Because only them would have asked for the missing items, which was the license and registration. Several witnesses came forward to say they had seen her car parked at the side of the highway in the early hours of the morning, but none of these people who had claimed to have seen her attempted to help her. They didn't stop. Considering it was raining heavily, she might have been in trouble and needed help, but none of them stopped to offer any type of help. So the search for Lisa began. There was a lot of volunteers looking into the area and the bushes, passing out flyers. Everyone on the island was talking about Lisa missing, and they were doing all they could to help find her. Lisa's parents had solicited help from their local church, and over 100 volunteers had turned up to help in search for Lisa. They distributed over 100,000 missing persons flyers across the island of Oahu. But by January the 29th, the search party began to lose momentum and major searches were called off. Smaller groups, however, kept going and searching, and they kept looking, but there was absolutely nothing to find. No single trace, nor lead, or Lisa's disappearance. But 10 days after she had disappeared, and 2 days after major searches had been called off, precisely by 2 p.m. on January the 31st of 1982, Lisa's body was found by a man jogging with his dog. She was found close to a ravine on Tantalus Drive in an area that was almost completely wooded and isolated, which was not where her vehicle had been located. Someone had taken Lisa away from her vehicle, harmed her, and dumped her. When the police arrived at the scene, they met the man who had called it in. He narrates that he was out walking his dog when he smelled something terrible. The smell was out of place, so curiously, he decided to trace where it was coming from. So he climbed down the embankment to look for the source, and sure enough, about 25 feet further down was a body laying face down. The police began to search the area for some type of identification, but they couldn't find any. But since Lisa was the only woman in the area that had been reported missing at the time, they were pretty much sure that the body belonged to her. The body was then taken off the mountain and transferred to the morgue at about 6:30 p.m. and through her dental records, Honolulu medical examiner confirmed the body to be Lisa's. When she was found, she had no clothes on except for 2 necklaces and 3 rings, with one being her class ring that had her initials on them. Whereas when she was last seen, she had been wearing yellow shorts, a V-neck blue sweater and leather sandals. Now she was naked and decomposing, so much the COD nor the TOD could be determined because of how badly decomposed the body was. Remember how I said earlier that her car was found just a couple of miles away from her apartment and a mile away from her parents' home? Well, where her body was found was about 10 miles towards Honolulu, where she was coming from that night, very far away from where her car was found. The HPD, which is short for Honolulu Police Department, was scrambling for information on Lisa's abduction and murder. They got information that there was a car that was seen following Lisa that night, and the car was said to have had blue-red lights, that the type of light that police cars usually had. So because of the circumstances surrounding how she had gone missing, the missing license and registration, the window half one down, the police then concluded maybe one of their own, an off-duty police officer, or perhaps someone posing as a police officer, might have pulled Lisa over that night and might have been responsible for what had happened to her. This idea of someone impersonating an officer wasn't completely new to the investigators in Oahu. Over the years, they have had periodic complaints from local drivers about a man out on this stretch of highway who pretends to be a police officer in order to get women to pull over. On one of these occasions, the police impersonator found out that the driver he had just pulled over was not a woman, but actually a man with very long hair, and their encounter turned violent. I am not exactly sure how, because I couldn't find any reports that elaborated on this incident. But with what had happened before, the police at this time already concluded that Lisa could be in serious danger even before she was found deceased. Now, this police or police impersonator theory was what the HPD rode with for a very, very long time. But the problem with this was that they didn't see reason to look at this case from another angle. A witness came forward during the investigations to say at about 10 minutes past 1 a.m. that morning, Lisa disappeared. They had seen her car parked at the location where it had been found, and she was not alone, as another car was seen parked near her. The police then put her time of abduction at around 1 a.m. to 1:30 a.m. that morning. So as they looked to solve Lisa's case further, a woman came forward to say she had an encounter with a man who had been posing as a police officer. So according to this woman, this unmarked car with blue green lights had stopped her while she was on the highway, and she assumed it was a traffic stop. The driver walks up to her and asks for her license and registration, and as she handed it over, he tells her to come down from her vehicle and enter his so he could examine the license. Immediately, she sensed it was all shades of wrong, so she retrieves her license and zooms off. The man enters his car and starts following her. He sees him in her rearview mirror tailing her, and that scared her a lot until he branches off another road. That was when she felt a little bit relieved. She was able to give the police a good description of both the man and his car. According to her, it was a white man, about 25 years old with brown eyes, and he had a baby face kind of, and was very fluent in English, was about 5 foot 10 inches tall and weighed about 180 pounds, and that the car he drove was white. The public were kind of scared, Was there a policeman out there in an unmarked vehicle stopping and harming women? At this point, the police had to inform the public that they were not required to stop for unmarked vehicles and plainclothes police officers if they were not accompanied with one wearing the uniform, and they also had to put a ban on flashing red light cars. Fast forward to February the 4th, the HPD announced that they've made an arrest. Not exactly that they had caught who had harmed Lisa, but the person was one of the guys who had been driving around impersonating police officers. His name was Donald Santana, and he was in his late 40s. So he wasn't exactly a match with the 25-year-old baby-faced man that was described. He would be later charged for impersonation and possession of a switchblade, and that was it. Then yet another woman comes forward to say that the very night Lisa had disappeared, she had been pulled over on that same stretch of road on her way to Kailua. So this man, pretending to be a cop, stopped her and told her she was driving too fast. He didn't try to harm her or anything, he just let her go. She described him as a white man in his late 30s to early 40s. He had hazel eyes and he had graying blonde hair and must have been weighing around 200 pounds or so. And the car he was driving was a large green four-door vehicle. So because this man was placed at the highway where Lisa had gone missing, and at the time they think she went missing, and had stopped another woman in the manner in which they assumed someone had approached Lisa, he was now a person of interest. One thing though, they didn't know his name, so they made a sketch of him from the lady's description, but they, for whatever reasons, never released the sketch to the public. Since everything they have been doing concerning this case so far had come to a dead end, the police decided to look inward. Now, what if the person who put Lisa over that night wasn't a police impersonator? What if he was an actual cop? So they started looking at records, checking out officers who might fit the description or might have records that fit the category of men they were looking for. And that was how they came up with the name Thomas Byrne. Now, Thomas, who was a police officer at the time, happened to be convicted of second-degree assault on September of 1981. He was in fact convicted for assaulting a teenage girl that he had rode along with during the police department's ride-along program. But he wasn't given any suitable punishment for his crime. Rather, he was fined, ordered to undergo mandatory therapy and to carry out community service, and that was it. He was left to continue serving in the police force up until his situation came to light during Lisa's case. So as the police began to look into Thomas Byrne, they focused solely on him for a very, very long time. More so because there was this particular store clerk, I don't know what her name was. She claimed that Thomas Byrne had put her over that same night Lisa had gone missing, and that he had used blue-green lights on his unmarked car to stop her. Was this enough to make Thomas Byrne a suspect? Maybe not. But combined with his history, the HPD decided it was enough, and they refused to look into other evidences and suspects afterwards. Well, Thomas Byrne, while being questioned, said he did stop the supermarket clerk because of how erratic she was driving that night, but he didn't see nor stop Lisa at all, talk more of harming her. So even though evidences didn't match their theory, they tried as much as they could to make the crime fit their theory. Do you understand what I mean? So while the police was focusing only on Thomas Byrne, there had been another suspect who at the time was not known to the public. This person was given 2 lie detector tests and he failed both woefully. I know lie detector tests are not admissible in court, but it gets you to know if someone is being sincere or not, so you can know how to proceed with your investigations. So how the HPD dropped the suspect who had failed 2 lie detector tests but decided to focus solely on another didn't make much sense. There was a deposition later on about this case, and the lead detective was asked the same question. The part that the public didn't know initially was that this suspect who had failed 2 polygraph tests was none other than Lisa's boyfriend, Doug Holmes. So according to him, he failed because he felt guilty for not driving Lisa home that night, and because of that, he felt responsible for what had happened to her. And the lead investigator at the time said that was good enough explanation for him. No one was ever charged for anything as regards Lisa's case, and by 1984, the grand jury had been dissolved. Later on in an interview, Doug Holmes would claim that things were not so good between him and Lisa around the time she passed. He said he was going to end the relationship between them because he was going to college and moving on in life, and he didn't want her to pull him backwards because she wasn't growing. She was at a standstill working at a salon. This was not a nice thing to say about someone who cared for you, who drove all the way in the storm because of you. Anyways, many years later, when there seemed to be no progress on Lisa's case, Lisa's parents hired a private investigator called Bert Cornell, who started looking into the case from the very, very beginning. He was a retired police officer that had actually worked on the case before when it initially happened. He started his investigations by going back to interview witnesses that the police had never spoken to before. He finds out there was no reason for Thomas Bond to be looked at as a person of interest in Lisa's case in the first place. Other than the fact that he had a disciplinary action against him in the past, he didn't even fit the description. The case against him was actually a lot weaker than the police wanted to let on, as no one could actually place Thomas at the scene and there wasn't any type of physical evidence to link him to Lisa. Then he found out what had happened to Lisa's license and registration that had been missing from her purse when the car was found. Remember that? So what had happened was that night, as she stopped by MJ's store, as she left the salon, she had forgotten her license at the cash register after showing it to the clerk to write up a check. If the police had traced her step back to that store, maybe they would have found this information earlier. I am not sure how the store didn't even inform the police that they had her license either. Another thing he discovered was that the police had not spoken to the security guard at Doug Holmes' sister's apartment where Lisa went that night. So Bert Cornell tracked down and spoke with the security guard, and he admitted to seeing Doug Holmes and Lisa outside the apartment building at about 11 p.m. that night, and they were arguing over something. He, however, said that Lisa left in her car first before Holmes got into his own car and left the apartment complex. Then there was this other newspaper delivery woman called Charlotte Komaki. She said that while she was on her regular delivery route at about 2:30 a.m., a blue car drove past her and the driver was a man. There was also a woman in the car with him on the passenger seat who appeared to be asleep also. So the way she was seated with her hair slanted, she could have been unconscious because when the driver made a turn, her hair just kind of like slopped over. Later on, she saw the same car parked at the spot as she turned around, and as she drove up, she saw the driver just sitting there inside the car, and the woman she had seen earlier was no longer in the car. According to her, she had spoken to the police at the time, picked the man out of a lineup, and had given them her contact, but she never heard from them again. But the police, on the other hand, had said that her story had inconsistencies and had changed at different times, so her credibility was questioned. That was why they didn't contact her any further. But Bert Cornell, now as a private investigator for Lisa's family, was there back in '82 when Charlotte Komaki picked out this driver she saw in a lineup, and yes, it was none other than Doug Holmes, Lisa's then boyfriend. Let me add at this point that when Doug found Lisa's car and the police arrived at the scene, he had some unexplained scratches on his face, but the police didn't ask him further about it. In 1983, a second post-mortem was carried out on Lisa's body, so on June the 16th of that year, her body was exhumed by the HPD and sent to the Chief of Forensics Medicine in Los Angeles. A toxicology test was done at this point. Remember, this was a full year later, and it was said that she had illegal substance in her system. Hope you know what I mean by illegal substance in her system. Even though this report was not made public, her friends deny she was involved in any type of activity that involved doing illegal substances. Was she loaded with this when she was abducted? No one knows. And by the way, why didn't they order a toxicology when her body was found in the first place? Well, this wasn't all. When Lisa's body was exhumed, it was discovered it had been manhandled. First and foremost, the body was still in a body bag. You know what that means? They buried her in the body bag which they used to retrieve her from the ravine where she had been found. I thought usually they take the body out, wash it and prep it for post-mortem. So was the first one done while she was still laying in the bag, or was she returned into it afterwards, or what? Her casket was also filled with dirt and debris. This wasn't okay at all. Apart from this, Lisa's skull and jawbone that had been taken to the medical examiner's office to check for head trauma was nowhere to be found. The police, of course, pointed fingers at the medical examiner's office, and they in turn said they returned them to Lisa's casket. I'm not exactly sure what happened with this situation, but this goes to show how careless they had been with Lisa's case. Lisa's case remains unsolved to this day. Maybe if her body could be exhumed once again with new technology, something will be found. I don't know. It's probably a long shot. Chester and Patrice, Lisa's parents, got divorced in 1990. It was said that Lisa's demise drove them apart. They are no longer alive and they never got to know what really happened to their daughter that fateful night. A lot of time has passed and the case is now as cold as ice. That's all I have for you today, guys. Do subscribe if you love my content. You can also send me your case requests via Instagram. Until next video, take care of you and yours.